When my kids were real little, like 3 and 4, they had a set of toy play tools, like power tools, like carpenters' tools. They were plastic, and some had little buttons you could press to make them work. Some made a sound if you moved them. Some were basically just sort of colored plastic to look like a ruler or a saw or a hammer. And they understood how those tools worked. And so as they got a little bit older and could come down into the basement workshop where the real tools were, I can remember a day when my kids, one of them found my cordless screwdriver, and they recognized the shape, right? They had seen something like this because they had a toy one, and they expected it to be the same. Oh, Daddy, you have a toy screwdriver too. And maybe they thought because it didn't plug in, it must also be a toy, or just pretend. Maybe because it looked like what they had seen. But I can remember when picking them up and, oh, this is a lot heavier, Daddy. And at first just sort of pressing the trigger and, this is just a toy because it doesn't do anything either. This is safe to be around. And then watching them nudge the button accidentally and turning it on. And not only was there a loud noise, and there was motion, and there was lights on it, and they realized this thing in their hands had an awful lot more power than they had expected it to. Something a lot, not only heftier, but something a lot more powerful, maybe more powerful than they knew what to do with, had been right in their midst all along. Not dangerous necessarily, unless you were really, really reckless with the screwdriver, but certainly a certain awe came over them, like, whoa, this is a grown-up tool, and this really could put something together, or this could cause some damage. I'm going to be careful with this. I've been thinking about that a lot, thinking about that expression I can remember on my son's face as he finally got that cordless screwdriver to work and realized it was a real thing with real live power there at his fingertips. I've been thinking about that expression on his face in a story that comes from Mark's Gospel. This is a story I'll share with you. It comes from the end of the 4th chapter of Mark, right after Jesus has told some stories to the people listening about how God's reign is kind of surprising, how it looks small but turns out to have this immense power, like a mustard seed that becomes this big shrub that is sturdy enough to welcome birds to make their nests in its shade. This sort of amazing power that's like watching a field full of planted seeds burst into life when you were looking the other way. That kind of surprise is here in this story. It goes like this. On that day, when evening had come, Jesus said to them, "Let us go across the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they awoke him and said, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" That's probably a story you've heard before. It's one of those stories that early on somewhere in our church life, if you've grown up being a part of a church, going to Sunday school or hearing the stories of Jesus, it's one early on we tell to kids because it's exciting, it's dramatic, right? There's a storm and the boat is getting swamped with water and there's Jesus taking a nap in the back of the boat. And the disciples, they wake up, "Jesus, don't you care that we're perishing?" And then, when Jesus actually does something about the situation, they're blown away. The translation there in the New Revised Standard says they were filled with great awe, but that's kind of a polite way of translating the Greek. The more literal Greek is they feared a big fear. And they feared a big fear, not just before Jesus wakes up and calms the storm. Obviously, they're afraid when the windstorm is coming. They're obviously afraid when the water's crashing over the edge of the boat and sort of took them by surprise. They're afraid after Jesus has silenced the wind and the sea. This is the kind of detail that kind of used to upset me. I mean, it doesn't make sense, right? The way you expect the story to go is disciples afraid, they talk to Jesus, Jesus does something, everything's happy, everybody's good at the end, all the loose ends tied up, and everything's back to normal. I grew up on so many TV sitcoms where the plan was silly opening, tension and problem in about minute 3 of the story, all resolved by 22 minutes and 30 seconds in time for the closing credits and the commercial break before the next sitcom that did it all over again. I grew up on a lot of storytelling and TV shows where the goal of the story was to get things back to normal, and all the fears or anxieties raised at the beginning of the show in the first act all were resolved before the last commercial break. Jesus' stories don't work that way, do they? Jesus is certainly there to resolve the problem. He speaks to the wind and the sea, and they answer him. But I'm not sure the disciples were expecting that kind of help. I don't think they realized what amazing real power was right there, just at arm's reach for them. I imagine the look on their face was kind of like watching my son think he was playing with a toy screwdriver and then all of a sudden realizing he had real power right at his fingertips. This was an awful lot bigger deal than he had realized. I think the disciples are afraid not that Jesus isn't able to help, but that he does, and that he really does have the power of God. If that's true, if Jesus really does have the power of God, they aren't just playing anymore. Something very real, very serious is unfolding, and they've been invited to be a part of it. To be honest, I think sometimes this is our challenge as church, as the people of God. I think it's an awful lot easier to play at church. I think it's an awful lot easier to imagine. We don't really think Jesus does stuff. We just sort of gather together because it's what we do. It's our routine. To be a good, upstanding citizen, you're supposed to go to church and be nice and behave, but we don't really expect God to sort of change the world. We don't really expect God to bring a new kind of creation. We don't really expect things ever to change. This is how the world is. We should just get used to all the terrible things that happen, and there's violence and there's famine, and that'll just be how it always is. But we go to church and we sing our songs, imagining nothing will ever really change us or change the world around us. And as long as Jesus is just the kind of fellow who falls asleep in the back of the boat, and if you wake and say, hey, Jesus, couldn't you help us? And maybe if all he ever did was just sort of offer a sort of a weekly worded prayer, oh, Lord, here we are in the boat, help us. Or if Jesus had just sort of, gotten up and started bailing water out, doing what everybody else was doing, then we could imagine that we're just here to play. We're nothing really powerful is at work among us. Jesus is just one more guy who can help bail water out of a boat. I kind of think that's what the disciples imagined at first. When they wake Jesus up, they're kind of thinking, Jesus, either panic with us or start bailing water out with us. Nobody is thinking, Jesus, speak to the wind and the waves. That's not the kind of thing you expect your religious teacher, even your highly respected rabbi, to do. You expect him to bail water, you expect him to panic, you expect him maybe to pray, but you don't expect him to speak to the wind and the waves. And if he does, and if the wind and the waves obey, there is a power right in your midst that you were not bargaining for. Sometimes I think we pray not really wanting God to answer our prayers. And maybe that's not something you expect a preacher to say out loud, much less put on the internet. But I think sometimes we pray so half-heartedly. We expect that God doesn't really move or respond or answer, that it's safe to pray things, knowing that our lives are just going to keep going on unchanged. There's an old line of Frederick Buechner's. He takes a look at the words we call the Lord's Prayer, and he says, if we seriously meant those words, we should be prepared for everything to change, right? God, your kingdom come on earth, your will be done here on earth as it is in heaven. I think a lot of times we mouth those words thinking they are safe, thinking, okay, I've said the words I was taught to recite, now I'm just going to go back and live my life business as usual, no change, nothing will change in my life. But if we dare to believe God really will respond to that prayer, that God really is alive, that God's really there in the boat and has the ability to speak and change, everything might change in our lives. For God's will to be done is going to mean an awful lot of rearranging of your and my priorities. It's going to mean maybe I don't get to hoard my stuff anymore or live only to acquire more and bigger stuff. It's going to mean that I rearrange how I use my time and my priorities. It's going to mean that when we pray for God's kind of reign, where justice and mercy are at home, that will change things among us. We have gotten so used to rottenness, to terrible things in the world around us. Maybe we think they can never change. We've slowly gotten used to a world where kids go to school and have active shooter drills because we think, well, that's just how the world is. There's always going to be that threat, and there's always going to be the danger of just kids sort of getting killed because that's how the world is. What if something different were possible? What if God's power to create a new kind of people who don't build their lives on we have to kill each other every time something upsets us? What if we dared to believe a God who really makes peace, who enables us to beat our swords into plowshares, really is at work among us? What if a God who is able to bring peace to the troubles in our hearts and the storms in our lives really is in the boat with us? Well, then everything's different. Sometimes we get so used to the rottenness that is part of our daily life that we just come to accept, that we become afraid of change, that we become afraid of things being different, of things being better, that we almost start fearing when Jesus gets to moving and stirring things up. I think about the storytelling back in the days of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And there was an awful lot of folks, Christian folks, church-going folks, who were afraid of the idea of ending segregation, of ending Jim Crow, for example. Not because in abstract they didn't think, yeah, really we should treat everybody equally, yeah, we should give everybody equal opportunities. It wasn't that they didn't like the idea, it was they were afraid of things actually changing. They couldn't imagine a world where what they were used to would be different. And they were so afraid of that kind of jarring change, they almost would rather just keep things the way they were and quietly say, well, this isn't ideal, but it's at least what we're used to. If we dare to call on Jesus in our midst and believe that he really is the kind of person who can speak to the wind and the waves and they will answer him, we should be prepared for Jesus to shake things up among us and for things to be better, even qualitatively better, way better, infinitely better than we might have imagined, rather than us just getting used to rottenness and saying, this is how it is, it can never really change. I think the thing that makes the disciples afraid is the realization, if they are in a boat with somebody who can actually speak to the wind and the waves, then they can't ignore him anymore. They can't treat him like an optional one voice to listen to among many. If Jesus really has the power to speak to the wind and the waves, then what he says is true, and who he claims to be really is true, that he really has the kind of power and authority that only the living God has, and that they can't ignore him or soft pedal him anymore. That when Jesus says things like, we're going to create a new kind of community where we love our enemies, we're going to create a new kind of community where everybody gets fed, we're going to create a new kind of community where outsiders are welcomed and sinners are forgiven, and the people who were told you aren't good enough find the place of honor and are lifted up. And those aren't optional choices anymore. I think the disciples realize in that moment, when they hear Jesus speak to the waves and they are quiet, their world just got a whole lot stranger and wilder and more wonderful than they bargained for. It was like realizing they'd been playing for so long, and all of a sudden the real power was right there in their midst. Maybe that's the invitation for us today. to quit playing church and to dare to believe the one who is right here beside us actually has the power to bring about a whole new creation. And he's gathered you and me to be a part of it. Let's see where that takes us, even if it means being surprised by the power right in our midst.